Talk about Revelation chapter 13. This is kind of a scary chapter because we're talking about how the dragon comes out and he brings up a couple of beasts, one from the land and one from the sea. But remember last time in chapter 12 we talked about the dragon who was cast out of heaven, and there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels cast him out, and there had to be this war, because now that Jesus is in heaven, there's no room for the devil anymore. Jesus is in heaven and he's our advocate. So there's no room in heaven for the devil anymore, and so he's cast out. He's condemned to be on earth for the rest of his time until Jesus comes in judgment and casts him in hell and locks him in hell forever. So the dragon is now on earth as a destroyer. He's no longer able to be our accuser in heaven. He's become now our destroyer on earth. This is Satan's role on earth, the destroyer. And we have this name for him that comes up as he comes out of hell in the trumpets. You know, when the trumpets are blown in chapter 8 and 9, and we hear that the angel of the abyss who lets loose those locusts from hell in chapter 8, he's known as Abaddon or Apollyon, which means the destroyer. So that's his function now on earth. He's no longer just a tempter or an accuser. His goal is to destroy. And in particular, his goal, as we saw last time in Revelation chapter 12, was to destroy Mary and Mary's seed, which was Jesus of Nazareth. So last time we talked about that a little bit. Let me go into this a little bit more. How does the dragon do that? Well, on these dotted lines, these are kind of indirectly. In the first place, in the Christmas story, let's go back to the Christmas story. If you read the Christmas story, especially in Matthew, with this background in mind, okay, so remember last time in Revelation 12, we talked about the dragon lying in wait for the woman to give birth to the child, and the woman being Mary, and he was going to gobble up the child right away, but the child is snatched up to God. Mary is taken into hiding across the river Nile, okay, in Egypt, and what happens? The dragon is wrathful, he's upset, he's ticked off. All right, and so what happens? This all happens in Bethlehem. It all happens in the area where Herod is the king. King Herod, who's a paranoid. He's terrible. He's a murderer. We already know he's murdered several members of his family. And he's a terrible, terrible man. So he's king of Judea in this time, in the time when Jesus is about to be born. He's a terrible man. I think you could probably make a case for saying the dragon is behind him being there. All right? John says in Revelation the dragon is lying in wait for the child to be born, and he is somehow manipulating or somehow behind the scenes getting Judea set for that child to be there. Okay? So on the one case, he's setting the trap. That's what he's doing. Herod isn't there by accident. Herod isn't there by accident. Herod is there because it's a trap to begin with that's being set by the dragon. The dragon wants to get Jesus. So Herod is there. He's part of the trap. And by the way, so are his soldiers and his scribes. They're all part of the trap of the dragon. They might not realize it, and it might be hard for them to understand it, but they're part of the dragon's trap. The other part of the dragon's trap is Caesar Augustus and the Roman Empire. I'm going to say that now because I have to tell you some things about Caesar and the Roman Empire. We often think, and we've often been told, that if it weren't for Caesar, none of the things would have come together for Jesus to have gone down to Bethlehem, because Caesar decided he wanted to take a census of the Roman Empire. Joseph went down from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and it was a good opportunity for this to happen. And then within the next 35 years, the gospel began to spread. Travel was easy in the Roman Empire and all that blah, blah, blah. You had the Pax Romana. The Romans had pretty well civilized everything. And people were traveling around. And we get this idea. Pax Romana, by the way, is a Latin term that means the Roman peace. The Romans had made everything peaceful. Well, to a certain extent that's probably true. They had pacified things. They had brought things under control. But you got to remember that especially in the part of the world where Jesus lived, but in other parts of the world also, they brought it under control because almost everywhere in the Mediterranean it was under military government. Okay, there were some local governments, but almost everything, Roman soldiers were walking around, fully armed with shields and spears and swords. It was a military occupational government in many parts of the world. They brought it was a peaceful war. I mean, there was peace in many parts of the world because through warfare, they brought their enemies to their knees until they cried uncle. It wasn't peace through negotiation. It wasn't peace through, diplomacy or anything like that. It was peace through brute force very often. Holding hostages, having battles, overwhelming odds, that kind of stuff. And if there's, the difficulty is that if there's peace through diplomacy, that's one thing, and people kind of live with that. But when you have peace because you get people to cry uncle, that's not much of a peace at all. But we've been always told that, we have this wonderful kind of idyllic, kind of glittery vision of Bethlehem and Jesus and angels and shepherds and all that. But I'm going to tell you, I think from John's point of view, what John sees in the Christmas story is the dragon is behind everything. Why did Joseph take Jesus and Mary, or why did Joseph take Mary and Jesus to Bethlehem? Because the dragon was behind it. Okay? Yes, it's part of the overarching plan of the Heavenly Father. Yes, it would not have happened if the Father had not allowed it and prophesied it and seen it, but look at all of the strings that connect these things to the dragon as destroyer, lying in wait to destroy that child as soon as it's born. So what does he do? He gets Caesar to set up a census. Okay? Caesar himself is Augustus, is a military man. He's a soldier. He has created this empire by brute force, by military force. He's a paranoid guy. He lives in a palace full of intrigue and suspicion. So the dragon, in order to get everybody in position where he can swallow up that child very quickly, as soon as it's born, he manipulates Caesar and pulls some strings. Caesar is his puppet. And he manipulates Caesar to proclaim a census so that by proclaiming that census, that pregnant woman can be brought into one of the most dangerous places in the entire empire. Okay? Into Judea, where Herod, the paranoid murderer, is the king. All right? I mean, why would you want to do that? Well, okay, and we talk about the prophecy, the child being born in Bethlehem. But if from this other perspective, the dragon is pulling strings just so that he can get this child into the absolute most dangerous place that's also easy for Joseph to travel to. Okay? I mean, yeah, he could try to get Joseph to go to Rome itself and kill them right there in Rome, but that's going to be way more difficult for Joseph to do. It's much easier for Joseph to go the 70 miles from Nazareth to Bethlehem, where he's right there in the clutches of Herod. He's walked him right into his trap. And Caesar has helped him, and he's used Caesar to set all that in motion. And now Joseph and Mary and Jesus are right in the spider web that the destroyer, the dragon, the devil, has set in motion. When Jesus and Mary and Joseph escape by going into Nazareth, then he gets all upset, and we see that it's one of the most dangerous places for the baby Jesus to be, because they slaughter the 2-year-old boys, the boys that are 2 years and under in Bethlehem. And then when they come back, it's still part of the trap because his son is there, Herod's son, after Herod dies. And so they go up to Nazareth. Why? Not because it's Joseph's hometown only, but because it's not in the territory that Herod was the ruler of. Okay? Herod or Herod's son. It was outside the boundaries of Herod's territory. It was in a different area. It was in Galilee. Okay? And that's not where Herod had jurisdiction. So they're still outside of his reach in a sense. So the devil has to resort to some other tactic, and he's got to sit back and lick his wounds until, as I said last time, Jesus crosses back over the Jordan River out into the wilderness, and he confronts the devil directly. All right? So even though the devil has set this trap up through Caesar and through Herod, they manage to elude the trap, escape, and then Jesus, in his own time, when the time is right for him, he comes and confronts the devil. So maybe what we want to say is, when St. Paul talks about in the fullness of time God sent forth his Son, maybe it's not talking about the birth of Jesus as being the fullness of time. Maybe we're better off saying, is the fullness of time when Jesus came up out of the Jordan River and the Father proclaimed from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased," and Jesus went right from there to confront the devil. Maybe that's a better way to understand what Paul said, in the fullness of time. The time is right now for Jesus to say, okay, now is when the confrontation begins. So there we have the devil as a destroyer, okay, and what he does in so he's unable to get to Jesus directly. What he does in chapter 13 is he tries to get to the further descendants of Mary. Remember, we said there's several seeds, several levels of the seed of Eve. There's Eve, there's the seed of Eve, there's Mary, and it funnels down to Mary until it gets to Christ, and then it kind of broadens out again. And there's always been an understanding among Christians that the woman's seed then becomes the church. So it goes from Eve to all people, to the people of Israel, to Mary, and then once Christ comes, it broadens out to the church, so that the church becomes then the next level of fulfillment, the broader fulfillment. All believers then are the seed of the woman, and this then becomes the focus of the devil's wrath. He's not able to get to Jesus, so he tries to get to the church. And in order to do that, at the end of chapter 12, he's not able to get to Jesus himself, to the child, so he concocts and manufactures two creatures, or not, I don't want to say creatures, he manufactures two beasts, one from the sea and one from the land, and they're the ones that he's going to use to attack the church. Now, on this chart, I've got an arrow going from the dragon to the church, because there are some respects in which I think the dragon attacks the church directly. All right? But I think for the most part, what he does is he uses the beasts, and they're the ones that attack the church. Sometimes they attack the church directly, those are the solid lines, and sometimes they attack the church indirectly. We don't exactly see how it's happening, and we don't see their influence. It's kind of behind the scenes, the strings are being pulled, but we get indirect attacks against the people of God. But that's what he's doing. Now, I stumbled for a minute there and used the word creatures. I don't want to use the word creatures with regard to these beasts, because it's a different word that John uses in Revelation. Creatures I want to reserve for the four living creatures around the throne in heaven, and that's the word that John uses for those four creatures around the throne. I want to reserve that word for them because they are creatures. They have this, we need to have this sense of them as things that God himself created. They're created beings. They're things that we're not used to. They look strange to us. They have multiple wings. They have more than two eyes. One looks like a man, one looks like an ox, one looks like a lion, one looks like an eagle in some respect. They're very strange looking. We're not used to seeing them. You can't find them in a zoo or anything like that. But there is always this sense that God created them. That's why the word for John is creatures, and that's the word we want to use. The word that he uses for these things that come up from the sea and from the land is beasts. And there's this sense always when John uses the word beast that they had nothing to do with, or that God had nothing to do with them. They didn't originate from God. They weren't created. They were somehow manufactured. Okay, they were cobbled together, or as I've said in other places, you think of the cast-off dog toys of Wednesday and Pugsley Adams, and somehow Grandmama sewed these pieces together in Gomez Adams' dungeon and came up with these beasts. That's the impression that I get. Now, they're fearsome beasts, but at the same time, if you think of that picture, you got to laugh. You know, you got to laugh, and that puts them in their place. So the dragon comes and he calls them up, and however you're going to describe them, you got one beast from the sea and you got one beast from the land. And then he goes into some detail to describe them. And there's a lot of conversation over the centuries as to who exactly are these beasts. How exactly do we identify them? All right, and I don't know exactly how to answer that, because my feeling is, anytime we try to identify any of these things exactly, we're going to run into trouble. My feeling is, and the most commentators who are reasonable would say this. They would say that at least for John's audience, what he's looking at is the beast from the sea appears to be some kind of secular political beast. It seems to refer to kings and kingdoms, and it seems like what John is trying to do is slam against the Roman emperor, the Roman Empire and the Roman emperors. In their day, you know, everybody was, if you go back to what we said about the seven churches, all the seven churches were in areas, were communities where everybody was worshiping the emperor. There were all kinds of temples to the emperor and the gods and all that other kind of stuff. And it seems as though perhaps what the people in John's day could well have understood was this. The beast from the sea represents all of the temples of the emperor and the worship of the emperor and all the, yay, what a great guy the emperor is, and all of the hokum and the false news, the fake news that the emperor is such a great guy, when actually, as I kind of hinted at, the Emperor Augustus is really kind of a beast. He's, you know, does he bring peace to the land? Yeah, but it's the kind of peace that makes you cry uncle. It's the kind of peace that has your arm behind your back and has you to your knees and a knife around your throat and says, you stop or I'm going to kill you. He's that kind of beast. He's that kind of great guy. But everybody worships him and says, oh, what a great guy he is. And they put up temples all over the place. It's kind of like putting up temples to Al Capone. You know, I mean, how do you explain that? You know, or to some gang leader. You know, and you hear about that sometimes. So we get this gang leader, and he's full of, you know, his gang is just criminals, and they break in the law and all this. But you know, he's got some kind of sense of order. And you go, you know, what sense does that make? If the order is the order of terror, people behave because they're terrified of it. And that's the same way with this secular beast or the secular political beast. Then you also have this religious ideological beast that I have here. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the religious beast seems to be all the gods as well. At least for people in John's day, they look around and they see not only temples to Augustus, but they see temples to Zeus, Apollo, Diana, and all, etc., etc. And they're just as bestial as Caesar Augustus. They're just as terrible, because people are afraid of the gods. And people still are afraid of a lot of gods. You know, they're afraid of what God is going to do. They're afraid of the God of the Bible, right? That's the way you hear when you hear people talk. I'm afraid of what God is going to do, or God is going to get you for that. There's a lot of fear involved in that. And so what St. John is saying is, you know, it's that kind of fear of those kind of gods is just, you know, an indication that that God that you've constructed is just a beast. It's a construct. It's something that's been manufactured. It's not really the true God that brings us grace and goodness and the love of our Lord Jesus Christ. So, and so those are both constructions of the dragon meant to destroy us. Whether it's a secular, political construction, like a government or something like Caesar or any kind of government, or whether it's a religious beast that causes us to fear the wrong God. So I think for the people in John's day, they were probably reading this, at least the people in the 7 churches, let's say, they were reading this and thinking, this beast, the secular one, is all the temples of Caesar. This beast, the religious one, is all the other temples. One last thing, before I switch to something else. At the end of chapter 13, that famous number comes up, 666. And then people say, well, I don't know what that is. You know, we got to figure out who that is, because St. John says it's the number of a man, and his number is 666. I think the most likely way to work on that is to say probably what John intended, or at least the people of John's day would have intended, would be one of two things. Number one, there may have been something in their culture where 666 was a number of somebody that they already knew that we just don't know. It's lost to us. You know, we just don't get it. You know, it'd be something like for us in the American culture in the 20th, 21st century, if you saw a picture of an elephant, you wouldn't think anything of it. But if you saw a picture of an elephant and a donkey going head to head like this, you would know that that's a pretty typical American symbol of the two major American political parties, right? A donkey and an elephant. Democrats and Republicans. And that would make sense to you. But if you lost sight of that over 2,000 years, you'd have no idea what that meant. So I suspect that maybe there's a sense in which 666 meant something to the people of John's day that we just have no idea. So that's one possibility. The other possibility that seems to make sense and has made sense for centuries to people is this. There was in the ancient world widespread in almost every culture this notion that what you do, it's basically a numbers game kind of thing. So what you do is you take whatever language it's in this case Greek, and you start, or we use English because that's what you're familiar with. You put numbers to the letters. So A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and so forth. All right? And then when you get to 10, it's 10, 20, 30, 40, that kind of thing. So you do this, and then you take the numbers of your name. Okay, so my first name is Chris, for instance, so C is 3, H is 8, and so forth. So you take those and you add them all up and find out what the total is. That's kind of the numbers game. What's the total? Well, so what you do is, with 666, you start with the total and figure out who do we know whose name probably adds up to that. And somebody says, oh, that sounds like, you know, Nero, Caesar. If you take Nero, Caesar, that kind of adds up to 666. Well, the problem with that is, I suppose that's okay. My problem with that is St. John talks about that as the religious beast, and Caesar was the political beast. Okay, so I don't know that that floats to do that. Okay, but it's the most likely thing because people did that widespread. The second thing is to say with that is it's more likely to do that than any other thing. But as I said before, with regard to the whole issue of identifying who 666 is, who the beast is, and you want to say who the Antichrist is, I think we need to be careful about saying it's this one definitely or it's that one definitely. I think we're better off saying there are a whole bunch of people who seem to have those characteristics throughout history, and maybe we just say that one has those characteristics, so let's be aware of it, and we'll talk about that in the next segment. This one has these characteristics, so let's be aware of it and stay away from it. And then wait until Jesus comes in judgment and then he says, okay, my people, that's the guy, and then we can go, oh, aha, okay, now we get it. You know, but there are others that resemble him, and because they resemble him, we should steer clear of it. The other thing I want to say about the number is the number that John wrote is the words. It's 666. It's not 3 numeral 6s in a row. And when it gets written and read as 3 numeral 6s in a row, what tends to happen then is people interpret it as, well, that's a numeral 6, and that's just one shy of the number 7. And we know in Revelation the number 7 is the number of perfection because it's always associated with God. So this is the number of the devil, so it must be a symbolic way of saying the devil is just one shy of perfection, and since it's 3 6s in a row, he's one shy of perfection in all 3 dimensions. And I got to tell you, that is in my way of thinking, that's an absolutely wrong interpretation, because John did not write 3 numeral 6s. First of all, they're Arabic numerals, and he would not have written Arabic numerals living in a Jewish culture, writing in Greek in the Roman Empire. He wouldn't have done that. In second place, in the text itself, the Greek text, he writes it in words. So when you see it, you need to read it out loud, 666. And then you have to think, what is important about that number, 666? Not about 3 6s, but about the number 666. And that's why I say it either has to do with the total of the letters in somebody's name, or it has to do with something else entirely that we've lost sight of over the centuries. You know, when they heard the word 666 in their day, did something register in their minds that doesn't register in our minds? Like the lyrics of a song or a slogan or something, you know. So there you go with that. All right, I'm going to stop this one because I have to switch a little bit, and we have to talk about the other parts on these things. Secular political domination systems and religious ideological domination systems. All right?